Alright everyone, well here's the narrated vertebrates in food webs PowerPoint because I didn't have the mic running when I gave this originally. One of the few stream jokes that I found. Please, if you find any, let me know. I need to have more. But I gotta get back to you. I'm watching a live stream. So last time we were talking about how energy in the biofilm gets to the rest of the food web because there was some evidence that this energy just sort of cycled back and forth in what's called the microbial loop between different microorganisms that are living in the biofilm here in association with each other and incorporating dissolved organic matter. So there was a question about sort of where this energy went. And so the myofauna were an important piece here. These very small consumers, the smallest consumers really in streams. Larvae of some insects like this midge here, and then some other tiny stuff like rotifers, which are tiny crustaceans, and then some species of nematodes as well. And so these are the missing link, and so they are able to consume some of these organisms in the biofilm, in the microbial loop, and then when larger consumers eat the myofauna, then the energy moves on up. So we're talking about a little bigger critters today, about vertebrates. And so I asked what kind of vertebrates are important in stream food webs, and you probably could have thought of several different types. But of course, we'll start with the most diverse aquatic vertebrates, which of course are fish, and a few different types that we've seen. You know, it's interesting when we look at fishes and really other consumers as well. You can get a good idea about how they're acquiring their energy from looking at the shape and placement of the mouth. More about that in just a little bit. So if we think about the roles that fishes play in food webs, they're very diverse, right? It's the most diverse group of vertebrates. So we can think about what fishes eat. So they can eat invertebrates. So there's a zooplankton in the center there, a daphnia, a microcrustacean. But they can also feed on these macroinvertebrates, things like caddisflies in the middle, mayflies on the right, hellgrammites, dobsonfly larvae on the left. And this is the majority of species. So these are common species in the Swannanoa River and our sites as well. Minnows like the whitetail shiner, as well as the river chub, benthic feeders like the sculpin and the northern hogsucker. They're primarily eating invertebrates, so it's a really important source for them. Fish are able to eat other invertebrates as well. The zebra mussel in the upper left is an invasive species that's gotten established in some of our larger rivers in the upper Midwest. And one of the species that eats them is the blue catfish. They're benthic feeders, and they can feed on these in great numbers. Similarly, the red ear sunfish, it has pharyngeal teeth in its throat that allow it to break shells of snails, for instance. Because these sort of shelled invertebrates are, of course, more challenging to get your energy from, but there are still some fish that are able to eat them. As we've seen, there's an herbivorous fish, the central stone roller, feeds on periphyton. And then we have fishes that feed on detritus, so basically decaying dead organic matter. And the fish on the top there is white sucker. It's a very tolerant species. We find it in creeks like Smith Mill Creek out in urban West Asheville, and even in Glens Creek here in UNCA as well. And the fish on the bottom is in the genus Procholotus. It's a South American fish. South American streams in the Amazon have a lot of fishes that feed on detritus because there's this huge input of organic matter into the streams during the wet season, and so fruits and things like that are a pretty big food source. There's some fishes that feed on aquatic macrophytes. These are few and far between, much fewer than other groups because it's hard to digest with the cellulose in them. The fish here is a grass carp, native to Asia, but now been introduced in a few places in North America. And remember how we mentioned that family, the fishes in the family Cyprinidae all have those pharyngeal teeth that are in their throat that allow them to grind up food, but they don't have teeth in their jaws. So these, the picture on the bottom there, those are the pharyngeal teeth from a grass carp. So you can imagine, right? They're able to grind up food pretty well with those teeth. Then, of course, you have piscivorous fish as well. So smallmouth bass on the upper right, bullhead catfish on the lower right, and even the creek chub, which I believe we saw a couple of in Sweeten Creek. You can identify it with that dot on the dorsal fin there. They, when they get big enough, also are piscivorous. And keep this idea in mind, right, that the diet of certain organisms varies depending on their size. So when they're small, they may feed on different things than when they're larger. Yes, this is the problem with being a piscivore. You might try to eat something that is larger than your mouth. It's a striped bass on the top there, and a largemouth bass on the bottom, although its mouth was not quite large enough. So thinking of trophic groups of stream fishes, we have insectivores, those are by far the most fish, detritivores, herbivores, piscivores, planktivores, which will feed by filtering water, or even by picking plankton out one by one if the plankton are large enough. And then we have omnivores, of course, which feed on multiple categories within this classification. So these trophic groups, ecologists, like other people, love to name things and put them in groups. But is there some benefit to characterizing species by trophic group? The first is that it helps to see how species relate to their environment, right? So if you look at, for instance, piscivorous fish, we find that they're generally characteristic of fairly high quality habitats, because if you're a piscivore, you're on the top of a food web, and so that means that there have to be lots of other fish species for you to consume. So for a food web to support piscivores, it has to be stable enough that you have other fishes that are there consistently. So we can group fishes based on what they eat, and it will tell us something about their relationship to the environment. Similarly, herbivorous fishes, it's interesting, we found them in some of the more degraded streams around here, and degraded streams often don't have real healthy riparian zones, so we get a lot of light coming into the stream, a lot of algae growing in the stream, and so the herbivorous fishes do pretty well. So, and as I mentioned, to some extent, you can look at the way a fish's body is put together and say something about what it eats. So the stone roller on the left, sitting on the bottom of the stream there, it's got, again, a mouth that has that cartilaginous lower lip that I think you all have seen. Uses it to scrape algae off rocks. And so you just take a good look at that fish and you can say something about what it eats. Similarly, the mosquito fish on the right has an upturned mouth. It has eyes toward the top of its head, so it's used to looking up and feeding up. And in fact, it's a surface feeder. It and other guppies on the family Pisciliidae are going to be looking up toward the surface and feeding. So to a great extent, you can look at the body shape, specifically the head of fishes, and say something about how they're going to be eating. So if you think about how fish trophic groups vary in abundance along the river continuum, we want to think about resource availability and think about what resources are where in that continuum. So Bill Matthews, in his book Patterns in Freshwater Fish Ecology, looked at upland, so sort of upland high gradient streams versus low gradient, further downstream areas. And he looked at the percent abundance of different kinds of trophic groups. And so in this high gradient stream, lots of insectivores. If you think, right, there's pretty good flow, it's probably keeping the substrate clean, it's great habitat for lots of aquatic insects. And so then in response to that, we have fishes that are there to feed on them, right? Just a couple of herbivores. Again, that's going to be the central stone roller. Moving down toward more lower gradient, in the middle sections, we start to see herbivores becoming more dominant. Not dominant, but more prevalent, perhaps we could say. And so again, in those middle sections, remember, that's where we have the open canopy, lots of light getting into the river continuum, and we have more of an autotrophic kind of system there. So in the middle part of the river continuum, you might expect there to be more herbivores, and in fact, that's what Matthews found. If we look at, and again, at the lowest gradient section there weren't herbivores, probably because you don't have stable substrate for periphyton to grow on and provide good habitat for other invertebrates as well. That's why you have fewer insectivores. But we look at planktivores, right? We find that the planktivores are prevalent further downstream, whereas they weren't at all upstream. And of course, again, that's because you have to have water that's sitting still for the plankton to become established and be self-sustaining. So we don't see that in the more higher gradient streams. So, these trophic groups might help us to understand availability of resources and energy flow along the river continuum. But like with any classification, there are potentially issues with it. It's a study looking at food use by central stone rollers out in Kansas. And when they looked at diet data, you can see, so when we think of central stone rollers as herbivores, and so diatoms are this sort of upper left to lower right slanted bar, and then filamentous green algae are the X's there, the cross-hatching. But what we see is that really what there's more of than anything else in their stomachs is detritus, right? So just this organic matter. So so even though they're herbivores, they've got a lot of, they're consuming a lot of other stuff. We can even look in the spring. You can see there was about 10% gut content was from animal mass, so insects. So one of the issues with this trophic group characterization is that we have omnivory, which is a challenge to deal with at times. To illustrate another idea, here's an example looking at largemouth bass, and these are data from lakes, but a similar thing happens with stream fishes as well. And they were looking at feeding and growth of largemouth bass in lakes in Michigan. So the standard length on the x-axis, standard length, in case you're curious, is the length from the tip of a fish's snout to the base of its tail. And then they had percentage of the diet of all these different categories. So crustaceans, some plankton, pretty small stuff, some midge larvae, chironomids, other insect nymphs in the triangle, and then fish with a circle. And really what you see is that the smallest bass were feeding predominantly on these tiny crustaceans. But then as the bass got bigger, the proportion of crustaceans in the diet got lower and lower. Similarly, these midge larvae, chironomids, right, fairly prevalent in the diet at very small sizes, but then goes away. On the other hand, fish were very rare in the diet of small bass, but as the bass got bigger, particularly between this 40 and 50 millimeter gap, you can see this great increase in the percentage of their diet. And so from fish that were 50 millimeters on up, fish were the most common item in diet. So what this means is that it's really challenging in some ways to think about diet in a species by species level, and maybe it makes more sense to think of it from a life stage perspective. because a bass that's 20 millimeters long is affecting the ecosystem in a very different way than a bass that's 60 millimeters long. So if we were to kind of lay out the problems with this characterization, the challenges are one, omnivory, that species eat more than one thing, and second, this idea of the ontogenetic niche, right? So this ecological niche that says that describes how a species interacts in its environment, the resources and conditions it needs, that changes as it develops, right? And so these trophic groups, the trophic group that a fish is a part of, is going to vary depending on how old it is. So thinking of other important vertebrates in streams, yeah, otters. So otters are native to the rivers around here, but they have been trapped and hunted till they were almost gone. But then they've been being reintroduced back to the ecosystem in an attempt to make it, more like our real river and stream ecosystems are. But these are crazy predators. They consume over 300 kilograms of fish every year. And I think I mentioned in the lecture, people often will ask, well, there's this river otter that I saw in my stream, where I like to fish for trout or bass or whatever it is. Is this otter is it going to affect the fishing in my stream? Well, the answer is probably yes. It's going to eat a lot of fish. But, we have to step back for a minute and say, well, these species are part of our natural ecosystem as well. So as these river otters come back, think HSS Fretwell trophic theory, right? If they're feeding on those top predatory fishes, then that's going to have cascading effects down through the food web that could be significant potentially. Yes, Landon is going to remind me that I need to talk about herps. So, especially in our headwater streams, salamanders can be really important. Remember, up in our headwater streams, they're more closely connected to the terrestrial ecosystem. So, for instance, crayfish can become important shredders, and salamanders can be very important consumers, important predators. So these authors were examining conditions in a headwater stream in our area. And so they created an experimental design where they had Blue Ridge two-line salamander, black-bellied salamander, so another species. Then they had both species together, and then they had a control where there was neither. And so they wanted to see how these salamanders affected the macroinvertebrates in the stream. This is what their experimental setup looked like. You can see it's a pretty small stream here. And so these little mesh boxes were created, and those were their enclosures. So either one species, two species, or no salamanders. So how do they affect invertebrate abundance? All right. So this is a result of an analysis of variance, and what you want to look at is the lowercase letters. And so treatments that share lowercase letters do not differ significantly. So we see, for instance, looking at total abundance of invertebrates per enclosure, you can see that the Blue Ridge two-lined and the black-bellied salamander, they did not differ from the control that didn't have any salamanders. However, the treatment that had both species did differ significantly, that lowercase b. And it looked like this was driven largely by abundance of chironomids, again the midges, whereas for other epibenthic abundance, so epibenthic just means species that live on top of the substrate, right, in the stream. They were not affected, although there's certainly a declining trend there. But it is interesting that, right, that just one species by themselves didn't play a role. But two species together did. And you see that little expected bar all the way to the right. That's the expected abundance based on the role of each species. So what that's showing is that two species together have a greater role than they do separately. So this is what's called niche complementarity or facilitation, and it happens when two species, in this case, feed in a slightly different way. So when you have two species there, the effect is greater than either one of those species by themselves, because in this case they're using resources in different ways. And we can see how that might be happening when we look at taxon richness. So richness is just a number, right? So the number of invertebrate taxa. And what we see is that the number of invertebrate species was significantly lower when both of them were there. So basically what that means is that when both of these species were feeding, they were able to actually eliminate certain species, whereas just one of them by themselves did not. So they were feeding on different species in different ways then, so that when they were both put together, it actually declined the number of species that were there. All right, well, in addition to danger from below in the form of fishes, danger from the land in the form of salamanders, there is also danger from above, and that was the topic of our paper discussion for this day by Steinmetz, who's the author.